You're listening to Compliance Conversations, your inside scoop on all things healthcare compliance, auditing, and coding. Now, let's get on with the show.
Welcome, everyone, to another episode of Compliance Conversations. I am CJ Wolf with Healthicity, and today's guest is Rebecca Busch. Welcome to the podcast, Rebecca.
Well, thank you so much. I'm happy to be here.
Yeah, we are so grateful that you're willing to share your experience and your expertise and your insights. Before we get into our topic, we'd love to hear from you a little bit. Just tell us a little bit about yourself, maybe your professional background, what you're doing, those sorts of things.
Sure, I'd be happy to. I'm going to give you my 360 Rebecca Busch tour. I actually started off in healthcare, believe it or not, at a very young age. When it goes back all the way to 8th grade, when my grandmother got sick and my dad would pick me up at 6 a.m. and she was in the hospital with a stroke, and literally I was at her bedside for that entire summer, 12-hour days, 6 a.m. to like 9 p.m. when he went home at night. And so How about that for an introduction to healthcare? And I haven't stopped ever since. It was actually my driver to go to nursing school. And then I had another milestone event in my career. I had someone in my family that got sick. So I started off as like a trauma intensive care type nurse, and I had someone that got sick, and it put me down this path of like compliance and medical auditing because I needed structure so I can take care of family outside. How about that for a typical nursing route, how we adjust? That honestly, it just opened up to a world that I never thought I would be in. And my career just was driven by my experience. And some of it, I went into internal audit because things kind of, break down in a hospital and you have to figure out how to fix them. And then sometimes my career took another turn where things kind of passed that gray line, and it got me into that whole world of healthcare fraud examination. And it's just been one experience after another. And at one point, I got calls from attorneys that would say, hey, can you help me understand this particular matter? And boom, that opened the door to providing expert testimony. And so it's been a runway since. And I'm telling you, with I have to admit, 4 decades of healthcare experience, I anticipate something new every year. And I anticipate some kind of continuing education to help put the latest puzzle together. How's that How's that for an intro?
That's awesome. I love it. It's always fun to talk to guests to see how they ended up where we are, because none of us probably envisioned it. But we kind of found our way into this world of compliance and fraud, waste, abuse, those sorts of things. And so appreciate that background. And that's actually what the legal aspect of that is what I was hoping we could pick your brain about today, because you have so much experience in that area. Maybe we just kind of start off with you generally explaining the kind of legal matters that you're typically dealing with.
Sure. So the very first case that I got involved with was actually a compliance billing issue, where an attorney called up and asked me to look at a group of radiology bills. And I was like, oh, no, they can't do that. And I'm mixing in my internal audit, my compliance, my coding background, like all into one piece. And it used to be my teaching example forever. And I would get up in front of a class and I would say, hey, what do you think of a radiologist performing a history and physical office exam and so forth? And they kind of look at me like, no, that's not normal. And so the whole thing of my legal career started off, and this is like actually one of my mantras is, all right, I need to understand what's normal, and then you can assume everything else is abnormal, because the variations that occur are just endless. And that actually, when I did that first case, I remember talking to a couple of attorneys, and I would ask them, I said, okay, well, what makes somebody an expert? Like, how do you start? What's involved with that? And then he's like, well, what, did you go to school? Yes. Did you do graduate studies? Yes. And then he went down the road map of, well, what other credentials do you have? Continuing education. Yes. Do you publish? Yes. So if you look at my CV, on or about the age of 30, I was like, okay, I just started like co-authoring or writing articles. And then I went to different credentials, like I'm a certified fraud examiner, fellow, I have risk management, whatever associations I belong to. I start off doing journal articles and so forth. And before you know it, you just pick one activity each year. You just pick one. And then all of a sudden 10 years go by and you look at your CV and it's like, but how did I do all this? You just do one thing at a time, and all of a sudden it just adds up. And believe it or not, amongst all of that, teaching is like my favorite thing to do, whether it's peers, patients, what have you. Just getting out there and talking to people.
Yeah, well, that's fascinating. Can you share a little bit about what some of your most interesting cases might have been? Do you have some of those top of mind?
They're all over the map. Okay. So if you think about compliance and what's normal in healthcare, you've got a patient, you got a provider, you got a payer. And if you do any compliance work in that segment, something always goes wrong. And then there's intentional stuff that goes wrong. So, there's always the funny ones, not funny and not funny at the same time. But, I had a set of healthcare bills and the doctor was in a difficult situation because the patient, he wasn't aware of the fact, was deceased. So, so you have to be alive to get stuff. And then, so you sometimes you have mishaps like that. And then sometimes you have more serious ones. It was called a rent-a-patient scheme. If you Google that, where you have a group of providers that would literally target employees, recruit them for healthcare services, provide them services that they don't need, and then bill like crazy. So that's kind of like on the fraud side. On the compliance side, sometimes, I get cases where the person is being penalized for doing the right thing. So I had one where it was a compliance officer. She reported the fraud. She stopped the fraud. She was trying to stop what was going on within the organization, and she was fired as a result of that.
Ooh,
So sometimes people will look at my CV and my healthcare background. They're like, well, wait a second. Why are you involved in a retaliatory discharge case, right? Because it was retaliatory, right? Well, it's because, she chose to do the right thing. She chose to follow the compliance stuff. So I actually was coming into it from a compliance perspective. The reason why we have compliance officers is because, we kind of want to keep the integrity of the organization, right? So literally, they've been all over the map.
Yeah, from a coding and billing perspective, are there any kind of trends that you see, or is it's like hit or miss? Or do you see? I mean, you've been doing it for so many years. Is there anything that's like, this has happened a bunch of times?
Well, what happened? Sometimes I like to use this analogy. You know how the IRS, we should, if we're earning money, we should be filing tax returns, right? You know how the IRS is constantly changing rules. You go to your CPA and they're like, okay, what tax breaks can I take advantage of? What are the latest rules, right? And so that analogy is great to think about coding. What are the latest rules? Because what people do is they push the envelope. There's a difference between pushing that envelope and then just creating a new one and applying the rules in a manner that are just incorrect. So I'd say the best way to stay on top of the trends would be to follow what the latest rules are, because those are the ones that they're going to break. And then if you do consulting work in it, it makes sense that if you look at what are the latest rules, hey, this is where clients and organizations are also going to need help in. I need to make sure that I educate myself on that. And if I could tell you one quick story, because I just remembered it. Remember 2010? What happened in 2010?
Was that
was when the Affordable, yes. Yeah. So at the company I work at, I always grant internships for all high school kids. That's like an employee benefit. I come up with something. And so one of my nurses is like, oh, can you give my son an internship? And I said, well, what is he studying? He's studying political science. I said, great, I have a project for him. So I had him come in. I had him get us an Excel spreadsheet up. And here's his summer internship. Sheet 1, he had to read every word of the legislation of the Affordable Care Act. In sheet 1, I want you to write down all the rules that have to do with healthcare. sheet 2, document any other rules that have nothing to do with healthcare. And then he did it. And then I sat down with him and I said, which list was longer? And he said, sheet 2, I don't understand. I said, welcome to political science. So I, and it was an exercise, one, to give them an introduction. You got to read legislation. And two, if you remember what I just said a few minutes ago, I'm always mindful of the latest rules. Why?
Right.
Because that's where my clients are going to need help. And then when it comes to expert testimony, that's where you're going to have conflict, where people are going to be looking for experts on, okay, how do I navigate through these rules and how does that impact these set of facts? So it's really, it's cyclical. So,
That's a really good example. One that comes to mind for me, and I don't know if you've dealt in this space, but, chronic care management was kind of these new codes. Medicare was going to cover them. And then you get all these parties entering the healthcare system thinking, okay, we're going to set up a great way to do chronic care management. And it's almost like, of course, there's people that are, most people in healthcare are doing things for the right reason. But then there's people that kind of want to take advantage of the fact that, Medicare is now going to pay for this. So they try to set up some sort of slick process or model that's going to, make them rich and this and that. And so then, then the years play out and then you see all these settlements related to chronic care management. So to your point about kind of just staying on top of the rules, because whatever's new, whatever's different, just wait a year or two, and that's where the enforcement's going to be.
That's right. And so one of the things I always tell, whether you're just doing traditional compliance, internal audit, or if you are actually involved in the investigative side, you should just go to cms.gov and print the OIG's audit work plan and read it, because they publish, these are the things that we're going to audit. Well, guess what? The things that they have on there are the things where they have seen problems in the past.
Exactly.
And it's a great guidepost. I've never met a compliance or internal audit department that had enough staff to do all the things that they actually do. Okay? That's just unfortunately the nature of the culture of it. So if you need ideas on how to triage or prioritize, I would look at that work plan, because that is telling you they've identified areas. And it's a good resource, a good self-guidance, learning, and what have you. As I tell my 3 adult children, by the way, and 2 of them are going into healthcare, you know what? You're stuck with continuing education. Education is just part of life. Okay?
That's right.
Treat it as a vitamin.
That's right. Take it every day. I love it.
Every day.
Yeah. Well, these are great conversations so far. We're going to take a quick break and kind of come back and ask you some more questions. So bear with us, everyone, for a moment.
Compliance is complex, which is why you should visit Healthicity's Resource Center. It features updates on the OIG's new General Compliance Program guidance, CEU webinars, and more. Visit healthicity.com/resources today.
Great. Welcome back, everyone, from the break. We're talking to Rebecca Busch, who has years and years of experience and expertise in legal matters relating to compliance and coding, reimbursement, those sorts of things. Rebecca, maybe we can get a little bit deeper into kind of your legal experiences. As an expert witness, you're probably going to be deposed, right? So, so any tips, or maybe first just tell us what a deposition is, because most of our listeners will know. But just kind of explain what that is. And then any tips for, if you are a expert witness, how to survive a deposition, so to speak.
Sure. You know what? I'm going to give you like an overview. So first of all, once you're done with your expert report and you turn it in, so that really is like the first stage, because now the other side is going to want to look at your report, and you may go to something called a discovery deposition. And the purpose of that is for them, they have an opportunity, usually 3 hours, sometimes they get more, to ask you questions about your report and understand the bases, they say it, for your opinion. Why are you providing the opinions that you are? An evidence dep is, this is the actual testimony that will be used at trial. So it's actually like going to trial. So I've done all of those. I have about 500, believe it or not, under my belt of that experience. Wow. And the most important, and I'm always trying to mentor people to get involved with it. The most important thing, whether it's your first time or the 400th time, is you just got to know your material. You have to be prepared. So if you think about it like anything else, you know your stuff. You're the expert. You're the one that generated the report. So just doing your homework. The second thing, and this I've actually, people who really want to get involved, take a class on how to conduct an interview from an investigative standpoint. And I'm going to tell you why. Because you all have experience that you're not aware of. And believe it or not, like 70, 80% of communication is nonverbal. So active listening and learning to answer the question would probably be phase 2 of managing a deposition and or trial. So the first is knowing your stuff, okay? Know it inside and out. And then 2 is learning how to be an active listener and answering the questions that are asked. Those are probably the 2 key attributes that I would think that is important, and prepare yourself. And if you ever have a client, especially if it's your first 1 or 2, actually even now, if I've never worked with an attorney before, I tell them, you got to talk to me before trial. I can't just walk in cold, because I need to understand your style and and words, right? We all use terms of art. You want to make sure that you have a handle on their communication style. So when they ask you a question, you're kind of like, wait, we haven't heard, you haven't used that term in our prior conversation. So I think those would be the high level considerations that I would keep in mind.
Good tips. So how about any hurdles or roadblocks or headaches that you encounter in this expert testimony experience? And if there are any of those, do you have any recommendations on how to approach those types of things?
You know what? That's a great question. And so a lot of my work is like narrative and spreadsheets. And so I had a situation once, for whatever reason, the first hard lesson, I hate to tell you this, is there's things you can't control. So if you have an attorney who didn't produce your entire report, especially if it in 2 parts, you just have to deal with it. And the judge wouldn't allow a portion of my report. So the statements that are important, I make sure they're in all documents. So if one gets cut loose, you're there. So there's, in my opinion, to a medical degree of audit certainty, blah, blah, blah.
Right.
I make sure it is in any individual attachments. That's one thing. The other lesson is, I'm like a visual person. I love pictures. And so a lot of times you prepare your report gets accepted into evidence. And then the attorney may want, I want to use a demonstrative evidence, meaning like, here's a picture, right? I want to show a picture. And the judge says no. So any charts or pictures that I think are good visuals to communicate to a jury, I put them in my report, because then it's already accepted. So these are just like minor little, tidbits, but goes back to making sure that your report, you should have an internal staff or someone peer review it, can stand on its own without you, that you are obsolete with your report, with just your report. That's probably one of the biggest skills to develop.
Good. So are most of these, I'm assuming most of these are like Federal False Claims Act cases. Is that accurate, or is it other
types of work? Yeah. So I do a lot of fraud related cases, but I have a bunch that are not. There's just typical, like one type of case that I have a lot of, especially for like the coding folks that are on the call. Whenever you have car accidents or any kind of what they call third party liability, they need to introduce bills into evidence. So a great four-way for people who have a compliance and coding background is they just want to know, hey, are these healthcare bills usual, customary, and reasonable? And so you're basically using your training to introduce bills into evidence. There's other work that I do, like life care planning, where the party's injured and they want to know, all right, well, how does this impact their life, and what healthcare services are they going to need in the future to address the injury? There's all kinds of caveat. Specifically to compliance, another one is, I had a software failure case where a provider purchased an electronic health record system. And it just didn't have what it promised it was going to have.
Gotcha.
It was like a nightmare. So really, if you think about, you know what, this is one way to do a self-assessment, right? Do a workflow of your job. For all of you guys listening to this, I get up at 8. Here's the functions that I work in. These are the services that I provide. These are the skill sets that I use. So that then becomes your recipe. Hey, you know what? I can be an expert on any of these day-to-day work activities. And then you build from there. Because that's in essence what people are looking for. They're looking for a better understanding of a particular event in a certain setting.
Yeah,
it's a great self-assessment.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. So you mentioned this life care plan. Maybe we go a little bit deeper into that. What's your process for constructing a life care plan like that?
Well, there is an organization that's involved with life care planning. And so it's a discipline. I use my case management and nursing background and my coding background and my finance background, where I interview the medical records and the respective providers. And let's say a person got in a car accident and, they're going to need a knee replacement, right? It's very clear it was smashed, so forth, what have you. And then I start listening to the doctors and they say, I'm going to need this type of surgery, that type of surgery. Then I go and I find the right coding language from a compliance perspective. I get the coding down for that service, and then I retrieve a price. So in healthcare, what do? We're always communicating. In the past, we go, what did we do and why? The what is the procedure code. The why is a diagnostic code. So if you have a past experience with that, when you're projecting stuff into the future, you're like, okay, well, what does he need and why? So then you retrieve the proper procedure codes and the diagnoses codes. Then you research, well, how much does it cost for that CPT code? Then you get your projection. Really? Do you see that?
Yeah, so that makes a lot of sense.
It's kind of like in most people who have a healthcare background, I mean, you've got some exposure to that, right?
Right.
I don't know anyone that, I should say 99% of the people out there, you touch the healthcare system, right? You go and you see your doctor. Am I fine? Yeah. Do I need anything in the future? Yay, nay, right? So it's professionally applying that process into the future. It's an interesting niche.
Yeah, it is. So you mentioned pricing. How do you research those prices? Are you looking, because a lot of payers don't publish, what their allowable amount is or something. Now Medicare does, right? Like they've got their Medicare fee schedule. But when it comes to the actual pricing, is there any tricks or things to find out when researching?
Yes. Well, first of all, there's an organization called Fair Health. If you Google it, they allow consumers to actually plug in CPT codes, and you can get some prices. Also, the Veterans Administration also has a tool where they collect that pricing data that you can also submit this. So if you learn to navigate it, and then most states have a workers' comp site. That's usually like what they call it the 85th percentile, meaning that 85%, or more providers charge this price, that you as a consumer can access it. So there's data repositories that are capturing data by CPT code, by DRG group, by ambulatory patient group. So if you know the genre of the healthcare service that's to be received, you can get the group, then you get the price.
Cool. All right, that's good. So I'm
going to throw more CEUs.
So I'm going to ask a very specific question here, and maybe you'll have to explain this to our audience and to me. But the Daubert standard. So what is that, and how do you kind of get ahead of any motions that involve that?
Another great question. So there's case law at federal and state level that basically says, okay, this is what qualifies you to be an expert. And anyone who wants to get involved in that, they should just Google the federal attributes, for experts, and just kind of read them. And when I talked to you earlier, remember I told you the story when an attorney said to me, what makes someone an expert? Right. That's your list. It begins with that. And so the way the biggest way that they challenge you on a Daubert, meaning hey, you're really not an expert in the product that you produce, really isn't, objective, doesn't follow scientific methodology, what have you. You mitigate that, one, by following the rules, two, by identifying your scope of work, three, being really the visual that I like to have people get in mind is if you ever took like physics or chemistry in high school, you ever do a lab report? The lab report, how you have to put down, here's the hypothesis, here's my ingredients, here's my methodology, this is how I did it, and here are my conclusions. If you follow that component in the field that you're in, you're going to meet the standard. Okay. Because in essence is, it's not like our parents growing up. Why do you have to do it? Well, because I said so. Right. So as an expert, you can't walk in there and say, well, it's because I said so. And this is what I think. Right. You have to actually create a recipe so someone can understand how you analyze the information and how did you get from point A to point B. That's what they're doing when you hear people challenging the expert. They're saying their report is flawed, or it's either the report is flawed or you don't have the training and education to be giving it, to provide an opinion on that particular subject. Gotcha. Does that help a little bit?
That does. That's fascinating. And I know our listeners are loving this because we haven't really done this topic before. And I am so grateful for your experience and expertise. We're kind of coming to the end of our time, though. We could talk all day. I would love to hear more. Any last minute nuggets or thoughts or encouragement or anything you want to say before we close here today?
Sure. There's one area of experience that I advocate. So at MBA, we give back. And we give back by taking, so many people a year that get stuck in healthcare, and we solve their problem. We actively advocate for them. And I'm going to tell you, it's been a PhD every time. And I'm most proud of an individual. Like if you ask me all the things I've done, I had this 28-year-old out of the blue call me. And she found my name by bantering with someone on Facebook. Ask her. I had her send me everything. 100% of her bill was denied. And she was on this $30,000 monthly payment plan with the provider. I looked at everything and I just did one of my rolling my eyes. You went through the emergency room. It's, there's rules about out of network. They have to pay it. I wrote up a letter. I use my compliance background, my training to help an individual on the front line. So listen, if you're in your organization, listen to those patient complaints or listen to how people fall through the cracks. And that gives you an outside perspective of how the organization runs. I'm telling you, they're nuggets of gold of knowledge. So that it feels good too when you help someone out and you accomplish something and you help someone navigate somewhere they're stuck.
Yeah, I love that. I had that experience recently with a loved one who came to me. They knew the field I'm in, and they came to me and they're like, I got this bill and it's like, $15,000. And I was only there for like 2 hours. And they didn't do anything. They just put me in a room and well, let me, get the documentation, send me the bill. I was looking at it and I'm like, yeah, it looks like on their hospital charge master, they may have just, had fat fingers when they were typing in, and they typed in, 220 units of this time period instead of 2.
Exactly.
And then I helped them navigate and who to call and how to kind of complain in a way that's going to get heard. And they're like, yeah, we made a mistake. This should have been 2, not 220. So it took the bill down from, the 15,000 down to like the $800 range. And that made more sense for this person. And so it, like you said, it feels good to kind of use all this knowledge to help somebody out.
And you know what you just did? You just gave a great sidebar example that if you're ever testifying as an expert, you've demonstrated your knowledge. How about that?
Gotcha. Yeah, there you go. Well, Rebecca, this has been such a joy. Thank you so much for taking time to share your experience. And to all of our listeners, thank you for listening to another episode. If you know of other topics that you'd like us to cover, please reach out to us. And if you know of other speakers or guests that we could invite, please share that information with us. We want this podcast to be useful to you. So,
right.
Awesome. Thank you, everybody. Until next time, take care.
Thank you.